Hello friends, welcome back. Let's discuss the houses in esoteric astrology today. How are they different? How do we approach the houses and their significations differently from the exoteric point of view or the traditional personality-centered point of view? The 12 houses are just as important in esoteric astrology as they are in exoteric astrology. However, there is a much deeper or higher octave of expression just in the same way with the signs as well. So the meanings of the houses change when we are starting to register soul impact. That's not universally true, and this is why knowing the significations of the houses esoterically is very key for the development of that intuitive faculty, because when we look at a natal chart, we can start to see how a planet or a transit or a natal position may be starting to express in a way that reflects much more of the subjective and inner quality of the soul compared with a more exoteric interpretation. And sometimes it's not that if one house is expressing esoterically, then all of the houses are expressing esoterically. It's a very nuanced and subtle, non-linear, intuitive process, as is often the case when we're starting to attune to these very subtle, interior, metaphysical layers of expression or reality. So we'll talk a little bit more about the houses today, and then we'll, for this video, focus on the first house, and we'll be doing a 12 video series on the 12 houses. I think it might be prudent to begin with this question of which house system to use. In the traditional astrology field, it is pretty well known that it's really just a matter of preference. People have different reasons for why they use some house systems over others. I actually find I move between whole signs and quadrant houses, that is mostly Placidus house system, and for whatever reason, in some instances, one chart works better than the other. So I always just gauge with the individual and what kind of impressions I'm getting, and just compare and contrast the charts in any particular case. So it's just an important point here to really emphasize what DK talks about in esoteric astrology, which is that there are no obvious lines of demarcation in the sky, right? So that point of where something changes and the other one begins, it's, yes, we can differentiate and distill different qualities. That is how our brains work. It is how our creation is unfolded. Everything is one at one level, but there's certain pockets of crystallization and the emergence of certain differentiated patterns when compared with the rest of the whole, of course. And this word crystallization is one to keep in mind when we think about what a house is or represents. It is a crystallization of a certain pattern of energy, in the same way with the astrological signs as well. So it doesn't really matter so much the house system, but it's always comes back to the developing intuition and being able to attune with the subjective factors of any particular chart or person, right? I think another point that's worth mentioning when we consider Hellenistic astrology and how this has had a resurgence thanks to Chris Brennan and the Astrology Podcast and a few other big time authors and things like this. Some people in that field have brought up a criticism of modern astrology, saying that, well, there was a certain point where Aries got attributed to the first house and Taurus to the second house and but that it may actually just be a convenience thing, and there isn't necessarily much practically that supports the relationship between the sign of the zodiac and the house. From my experience, I say that there is very obviously a correspondence to the quality of the sign versus the quality of the house. But where I think the Hellenistic astrologers get it right is that there is too often a blending of the significations. For instance, the fifth house in exoteric astrology, one of its significations are romance and sex. I would not say that Leo, the sign Leo, is inherently evocative of sex or romance. So there is very much a difference in terms of the activities and the qualities. However, when we look at it abstractly and from a multi-layered perspective, there is a very obvious relationship between the archetype of the sign and then what consequently manifests at the most densely crystallized level as the activities which are indicated by the house. For instance, while Leo as a sign may have nothing to do with sex in and of itself, I mean, insofar as I guess any sign can be connected to sexuality in that human beings have a sexuality as part of their makeup, but Leo as an archetype is that of the creative expression of the self. When we look at the different layers of that esoterically, or with that as a background position, we can say that the sun, which rules Leo at its most exoteric personality level, has a lot to do with the emanations of the lower three centers, particularly the sacral center as the creative point of the me. And in this case, the sun ruling the physical man, which has its connection to the animal body. So when we understand that archetype of the creative expression from the central self, then a part of that is the expression of the body in its creative capacity, and there we have the connection to sexuality. So once again, we wouldn't say you're a Leo, therefore you have this much more sex. That would be completely arbitrary, but we can see when we map it out in terms of the multi-layered approach with the archetype, then we can see that there is an interrelationship there. So for most of you, that is probably already a given, but I think it's worth mentioning just because that has been around in the conversation on the houses recently. So I thought it would be worth touching on there in terms of how I would bring an esoteric and synthesizing point of view to that conversation. Okay, let's dig into the first house. So let us start with the traditional significations, and then we will look at the esoteric significations. So we're looking at the physical body with the first house. It is the place often that is referred to as where the heavens and the earth meet, and of course it's at the eastern crest, right? So that's where the sun is coming up. That is why it's called the rising sign. So where the heavens meet the earth, and I think there's a nice piece in traditional astrology too, where I think it's the Hellenistic tradition, Mercury is said to have its joy in the first house. And I thought that's a nice little hint there actually at the Aries archetype, because we know that Mercury is the esoteric ruler of Aries and indicating the place where we receive messages from the divine. That would be the higher or esoteric interpretation of Mercury and its connection to Buddhi and the receiving of impressions through the brain. Aries rules the head. First house has a connection to the head and the brain as well. So just a nice little hint of where sometimes these some of the more traditional exoteric systems can pick up on these certain universality of some of these impressions that really check out at the esoteric level of analysis. Anyway, back to the delineations of the first house. The head, the face, physical body, interests of the personality. So this is coming to the overt physical expression and characteristics of the personality in a very obvious persona level way. Sometimes it can be referred to as the way in which the rising sign is kind of a filter for the sun sign as the core identity and something like that. Physical body interests, and yeah, this overall movement of the personality in this way. So when we're looking at the esoteric interpretation, we're taking all of those key points and we look at almost this higher octave of it here. So if we're thinking about the head and the brain, this is also where we have the receiving again of the mercurial impressions, or where we make contact with the soul or the core expression of the soul. And from the esoteric point of view, this deeper contact or awareness of the soul happens through the upper mental centers. We receive the impressions there. That is where we get clarity. That is where we get purpose. We're talking about the crown center and the seeing of the vision through the ajna center. So this impact here is where we have this core sense of purpose of the soul, and purpose being once again connected to this crown center. So where we have the overall quality of the personality and the correspondence to the body core expression, and then the head and the face, esoterically we have the purpose, the impact of the soul, the sense of I, the deepest sense of I as it comes through what I'm here to do and how I'm here to express, but as that initial pulsating impulse. So, and this is of course why we say that the rising sign is evocative of the soul purpose, purpose being that key word there. Now, DK in the Blue Book Esoteric Astrology actually gives the official esoteric delineations in contrast with the exoteric delineations of the houses, only for the first 2 houses. And he says the rest you can work out for yourself. Now, I've actually got here Alan Oken's book, which many of you are familiar with. And I was looking over his breakdown of the houses, and I think overall it's a pretty concise, good job. So I'll make reference to this as well. So here he's got the traditional significations in one column, and then in the next column the soul-centered one. So I'll read them out directly from traditional to esoteric, so you can see the nature of the correspondence that we have here in terms of that deeper archetypal level that I was talking about before. Okay, traditional, the physical body and its form, soul-centered. The soul body, or the causal lotus, which is said to be that holding point of the repository of all of the intelligence and gained wisdom and information, basically, of the soul. 2, the physical appearance, traditional, soul-centered. The aura, so now we're talking about the more subtle emanations, right, of the energy body, along with the dense level, which would be the physical body. 3, activities of the personality, emergence of the soul purpose. 4, characteristics of the ego, qualities of the ray type, so particularly in the nature of the rising sign in this case. So this, we look to the rising sign and the ray qualities of that sign, and that will be that will indicate a certain well, it'll just give more info on how that individual is expressing based on not just the sign but the rays as well. 5, brain and head centers and the chakras, mentioned that before. 6, urge for personal space or dominance of the environment, expression of manifested will, again the crown, so more of that, this is what I'm here to do. 7, the ego in action, soul-centered activities of the soul. So when we look at the natal chart in question and we're looking at the house, in this case the first house, we would look to the exoteric expression of the rising sign. When looking at a person, we go, okay, where do we see this? Can we get that overall quality and impression yet? Then consider the esoteric undercurrents of the sign, and we can gauge where and how much do we feel this from the person, or how much do they recognize it in themselves, and maybe they can see both prongs of that. And then we look to the esoteric and the exoteric rulers of the sign. So if we're going with Aries ruling the first house, we would look at Mars, exoteric, then Mercury, esoteric. And those indicate the overall direction of the personality versus the soul. So of course, most of you know this, in Hellenistic astrology, the rising or the exoteric ruler of the rising sign is considered the chart ruler, so really indicating something about the overall life direction and quality. Esoterically, we look to the esoteric planetary ruler. In the case of Aries, that would be Mercury. We look at where that's positioned in the chart, and that will begin to color the nature of the expression of the soul. So these are your basic points of chart analysis when approaching it esoterically, when you're looking at your own chart, or if you're looking at another person's chart as an esoterically practicing astrologer, let's say. But what about transits? Now, transits are another great way to indicate what level of responsiveness or activation of the personality versus the soul life are going on, and sometimes there can be both going on at the one time, and in which case there may be a quality of synthesis between those two different fields of expression, or a sense of duality and a push and a pull between the two, which can also be quite interesting as well. So transits to the first house typically would look something like changes in physical vitality, energy of the body. Let's say Mars transiting the first house can sometimes look like having a lot more vital energy. Can also look like being more accident prone. That's the cutting or separating quality of Mars, or the conflict aspect of Mars. Being more injury prone at this time. Okay, but how will we look at that esoterically? Mars going over the first house could look something like a round of conflict between the soul or the personality, or some push and pull of emotional energies between those two different desires, for instance. So this is where it gets a lot more nuanced and subtle, and where we have to become sort of scientists when we're approaching the chart, whether it's for ourselves or for other people, to really try and gauge what is the degree of responsiveness here. Venus going through the first house exoterically might look like some positive changes to one's physical appearance, getting a new haircut that looks great, or having some artistic inspirations, finding a new music artist that you really love maybe, and that is very inspirational or becomes an interest to you to research or perform that kind of music, something like that. So you think Venusian themes, or maybe an interest in relationship or romance coming into your awareness. So that would be, so even though you can see the hint of some of the head center stuff there, it'd be like the exoteric Venusian themes coming through the mind and in one's field of perception, and hitting that the physical level of personality expression or self-identification through the body as that exoteric first house expression. But okay, esoterically, what could Venus going through the first house look like? It could be an awakening of the Ajna center. It could be an activation of a recognition of purpose, or a seeing of how it could bring some of the esoteric Gemini themes into the experience, like bringing a sense of fusion between the higher and lower selves, or something of this nature. So there's a lot here to be researched and experimented with, and no better place to begin than with your own chart. But yeah, the transits can really be a fun way to start looking at what actually is the level of responsiveness to solar energies, and what are the degrees of the different aspects of personal identification going on in the individual self. Just trying to think what else might be important to flesh out with the first house. I guess we've kind of covered the basics. I'm thinking about myself as a Gemini rising. Okay, so exoterically, there is the obvious mercurial quality, a sense of leanness and dryness. There's some length and parallel lines in the facial features, which are pretty quintessentially Gemini, so we can see the effects upon the body, how I move throughout the space, talking with my hands. There's a very Gemini, very mercurial, all of this good stuff. And I suppose when I discovered esoteric astrology and I heard or learned about the esoteric delineation of Gemini, that was like a bomb going off. And then particularly with the learning about the rays, there was certainly a more refinement of my perception, and this is occultly considered the intuition that we're talking about, the occult intuition, which is that beginning to sense the more subtle levels of energy. Gemini is a second ray sign, so that quality of synthesizing and bringing things together, and really sensing that as the linking force of that second ray, or the contextualizing quality, and bringing that synthesizing context to what can otherwise just often look like kind of scattered mercurial awareness, something like that. So it's utilizing esoteric astrology and the awareness of the rays to become a little bit more attuned to that deeper interior self, or the solar self. So that can be really helpful in that way. And I also need to talk about planets in the first house. How did I miss that in terms of the natal chart? Okay, so planets in the first house in the natal chart, when we're looking at it esoterically, are going to be indicators of certain powerhouse forces that the soul is utilizing for its purpose. So first house planets are very important. They're important in exoteric astrology. They can indicate certain immediate impressions or qualities of the person. Someone with Neptune in the first house might have a dreamy quality, maybe a bit intuitive or psychic, or have that sort of dreaminess to them, something like that. in a similar vein as the exoteric planetary ruler of the rising sign anyway, but any planet in the first house is going to really be highlighted through that personal expression, through interests of the personality, through one's physicality, through one's body, through one's face, interests, all of that stuff. So esoterically, it is the powerhouse of that planet. So then we look to the ray force of the planet. If you've got Pluto in the first house, we take the esoteric interpretation of that when we're considering the soul purpose and interpreting the chart esoterically. So Pluto in the first house, esoterically considered, would be indicate a lifetime where the purpose is to bring a lot of death and destruction to the lower nature. There is a lot of transformation that is going to happen. People often pick this up anyway, even in an exoteric chart. It might be someone who's interested in psychology or being drawn to psychotherapy, and that would indicate also some of that's an esoteric hint there as well. But it might just be taken a little bit deeper, where there's a much more push to reorient towards the soul life, and that would be an indication too of the Piscean quality. So consider that as well if you've got any first house planets. You look at the house, look at the first house planets, purpose and intentionality of the soul harmonized with the esoteric ruler of the rising sign, and you can look to also to the whatever that planet is that and what it rules esoterically. So in the case of Pluto, it esoterically rules Pisces, and so that's going to indicate that flavor there. Pisces is the savior, it is the crucifixion, it's the death aspect of the Christ journey and all of this good stuff. So that is why first house planets are important. But if there aren't any first house planets, it doesn't mean that the soul doesn't have a specific purpose, because of course you have the esoteric ruler, so that is always going to be your first point of examination when looking at the chart esoterically. Okay, everybody, I think that concludes our exploration today on the first house, how we compare that with the exoteric interpretation versus the esoteric, and hopefully this gives you a few starting keys and points of contemplation when considering your own chart, and if you want to get a little bit more of a thorough map of your own soul purpose, and do have a look and have a think about the esoteric versus the exoteric interpretation of your sign, of the exoteric versus esoteric planetary ruler, and any potential first house planets as well that may indicate and reveal the story of the soul in this given life. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.